It was just another ordinary day in the city. People hurried along the sidewalks, their lives unfolding in a blur of appointments, errands, and routine. But on one corner there was something different. A small, humble art stand, tucked away between the hustle of a busy street, was about to change the life of one young woman forever. Sophie Carter, a 24-year-old artist, sat behind her wooden booth, her fingers trembling as she adjusted a piece of canvas. The bright sunlight beat down on her, but it wasn't the heat that made her feel dizzy. It was the weight of everything she was fighting for. Every stroke of paint on her canvas had a purpose. Every color mixed on the palette wasn't just art, it was a fight for her life. She had come to a point where her survival depended on more than just doctors and treatments. She was painting for something bigger. She was painting for hope. With the flick of her brush, Sophie poured her heart onto every canvas, each painting more than just a picture. It was a plea for help, for a chance, for a life. But no one stopped, not at first. People walked by without a glance. A few looked, nodded politely, but no one stopped. And yet Sophie kept painting, her gaze never wavering from the vibrant canvases in front of her. She wasn't just fighting to be seen, she was fighting to survive. Then, as if the universe itself had decided to give her a chance, a figure emerged from the crowd. Sophie barely noticed him at first, a man, tall and solid, with an air of quiet confidence. But when he stopped in front of her stand, Sophie's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't like the others. Something about him felt different. And just like that, everything was about to change. Sophie's struggle, the weight of survival. Sophie Carter's life had been a tapestry woven from vibrant colors of hope and passion. Since she was a young girl, she had been drawn to the world of art. Her sketches, paintings, and canvases had always been a reflection of her inner world, her dreams, fears, and the beauty she saw in the world around her. Art had been her escape, her therapy, and most importantly, her purpose. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the pain that would come when the world around her suddenly shifted, leaving her fighting for something far more precious than she could have ever imagined. At just 22, Sophie was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors used words like aggressive and high risk, their voices hollow as they delivered the news. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. How could this be happening to her? She was so young, with a life ahead of her, dreams to chase, art to create, and moments to experience. Yet there she was, sitting in a sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines that beeped incessantly, marking the passage of time as though each moment was one closer to a future she wasn't sure she would get to see. The treatments began immediately, and Sophie endured them with a resilience that surprised even her. Chemotherapy drained her body of strength. Her hair, once a symbol of her youth, fell out in patches, leaving her with a raw sense of vulnerability. But it wasn't the physical toll of the illness that was the hardest to bear. It was the emotional weight, the constant worry in her parents' eyes, the guilt she felt for being the reason they were so stressed, and the crushing reality that her life had now become an endless cycle of hospital visits, needles, and pain. Every time she looked at her mother, her heart ached. Her mother had always been her rock, the person who supported her through every endeavor, who had painted her dreams on a canvas of encouragement. But now, Sophie saw the weariness in her mother's face. She could hear the crack in her voice when she said, "We'll make it through this, Sophie. We'll get you the treatment you need." And her father, ever the optimist, always tried to reassure her, but his attempts only made Sophie feel more trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. And then the financial strain hit. The treatments were expensive, far more than their insurance would cover. Sophie had seen the bills piling up, the envelopes marked with urgent and final notice. Her parents had emptied their savings just to pay for the first round of chemotherapy, and now they were facing another mountain of debt. Her mother had even considered selling the house, but Sophie refused to let them sacrifice everything for her. She couldn't bear the thought of them losing their home, their future, all because of her illness. One evening, as Sophie sat in her hospital bed, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her, a new kind of fear settled in her chest. It wasn't the fear of death. That was something she had learned to live with. It was the fear of watching her family crumble under the weight of her illness, watching her parents lose everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of, just to keep her alive. She couldn't do that to them. She couldn't be the reason they suffered. That night, as the world outside her window fell silent, Sophie stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. And then it hit her. Art! She had always turned to her art to escape her troubles, to express herself when words failed. But now, her art could be more than just a form of expression. It could be a lifeline. She wasn't just painting to fill a void or express a feeling. She was painting to survive. Every brushstroke, every color she mixed was a plea for help. If I can sell my art, maybe I can help pay for the treatments. If I can sell enough, maybe I can save my life. Sophie's heart raced as she thought about the possibility. But then doubt crept in. Who would buy art from a girl on the street? The thought of sitting at a corner with a sign asking for help felt humiliating. But the desperation in her chest drowned out the fear. She had no other choice. Her family had already sacrificed so much, and she couldn't sit back and watch them give up everything for her. She needed to take control of her future. And she needed to do it through her art. The next morning, she didn't wait for a miracle. She set up her small art stand on a busy street corner. It wasn't much, just a few canvases, some paint, and a sign that read, "Original Art Funding My Cancer Treatment." The weight of the sign felt heavy in her hands as she placed it in front of her booth, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen, from an artist with dreams to a girl desperate for survival. The first few hours were painfully slow. People walked by, some glancing at her art, others not even noticing her. Sophie fought the exhaustion in her body and the aching in her bones, determined to stay positive. She forced a smile for each person who stopped to admire her work, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that no one cared, that no one would ever understand. The afternoon sun beat down on her, making her dizzy, but Sophie refused to let herself falter. She was fighting for her life, and there was no time for doubt. Just as she was beginning to lose hope, a woman in a navy blazer stopped in front of her booth. She paused for a moment, admiring one of Sophie's pieces, a painting of a sunset over the ocean, bold strokes of orange and purple blending into the deep blue sky. The woman smiled and asked how much it was. $80, Sophie replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman hesitated for a moment, glanced at her husband, and then nodded. "We'll take it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The transaction felt surreal, like something out of a dream. She handed over the painting and the woman handed her the cash. The woman's kindness felt like a lifeline, and for the first time in days, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would work. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start. But Sophie wasn't done yet. She wasn't just selling art. She was fighting for her life, and she wouldn't stop until she had the chance to win. Media attention, the power of sharing her story. Sophie's heart raced as the days went on, each one feeling like a battle in itself. Her small art stand had become both her refuge and her war zone. She had sold a few paintings, but the money was barely enough to cover a fraction of the mounting bills. The weight of her situation pressed heavily on her shoulders, but Sophie wasn't the type to give up. She had come this far and she wasn't about to stop now. The road ahead was steep, but if there was even a small chance that her art could help her survive, she would keep painting, keep fighting, no matter how hard it got. Each day, Sophie set up her booth, knowing that her time and energy were limited. The chemotherapy treatments had drained her physically, and the relentless summer heat only made it worse. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the quiet moments when people passed by, indifferent to the girl sitting at her stand. Some glanced at her paintings with passing curiosity, while others walked by without a second thought. Sophie had learned to hide the hurt behind a smile, telling herself that someone would eventually stop. But each hour felt like a battle to hold onto the fragile thread of hope that was her only lifeline. Then, on the fourth day, something unexpected happened. A young woman approached Sophie's booth, her eyes wide with interest as she looked over the paintings. Sophie glanced up at her and immediately noticed something different in the way the woman moved. She wasn't just glancing at the art, she was looking. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as the woman spoke. "These are incredible," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Sophie blinked, a bit taken aback by the question. No one had ever asked her that before. Most people only seemed to care about the price, but this woman saw her, saw the artist in her. She nodded slowly. Yes, Sophie replied, her voice a little shaky. I painted them all. The woman smiled and pulled out her phone. I run an online arts blog, she said, excitement in her voice. I love finding hidden talent, and you've got something special here. Mind if I take a few photos? Sophie hesitated for just a moment. She hadn't thought much about getting media attention. She had never imagined that someone would find her art worthy of sharing with a larger audience. But something in the woman's sincerity made Sophie feel like she was being seen for the first time in weeks. She agreed, and the woman began taking pictures of her paintings and of Sophie sitting at the stand. After a few moments, the woman looked up from her camera and smiled. What's your story? She asked. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. No one had asked her that. No one had asked about her life, about the battle she was fighting, about the reason she was standing on this street corner selling her paintings. Sophie opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She had never been the type to share her struggles with anyone. But something about this woman, this stranger, made her feel like it was okay to tell her story. So, with a deep breath, Sophie began. She told the woman about her diagnosis, about the cancer that had turned her world upside down and forced her to confront her own mortality. She spoke about the treatments, the pain, the constant exhaustion. She told her about the financial burden, the way her family was struggling to cover the costs of her treatments, and the fear she carried every day that they would lose everything in the fight to keep her alive. She didn't hold back. She told the woman about her decision to sell her art, about how painting had become her lifeline, the only thing she could control in a world that had suddenly spiraled out of her grasp. The woman listened intently, her eyes soft with empathy. People need to hear this, she said once Sophie finished speaking. This is a story that needs to be shared. Sophie didn't expect much. People made promises all the time, but she knew the harsh reality. Stories like hers were often forgotten in the noise of the world. She had no idea that this seemingly small conversation would change everything. The next morning, Sophie arrived at her booth earlier than usual, exhausted from the previous day but determined to keep going. She set up her canvases and placed her sign back in front of the stand. But something felt different. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the air around her seemed charged with anticipation. By noon, the crowd around her booth had grown. People were stopping, not just to glance at the paintings, but to buy them. Sophie sold more paintings in the first 2 hours than she had in the last 3 days combined. The excitement was palpable. There was a sense of movement in the air, a new energy that Sophie hadn't felt before. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas, her best friend. She opened it, her heart racing as she read the message. Dude, check this out. She clicked on the link, and her breath caught in her throat as the page loaded. The article was titled Fighting for Art, Fighting for Life, the teen who's painting her way to chemotherapy. It was the blog post that the woman had promised to share. The words were heartfelt, the story raw, and it captured everything Sophie had been feeling, her struggles, her fight, and her unwavering determination to survive. As she scrolled down, Sophie saw the photo of her standing at her booth, a smile on her face despite the exhaustion in her eyes. The blog had already gone viral, with thousands of shares, comments, and messages of support flooding in. People from all over the world were now following her story, offering words of encouragement, buying her art, and sharing her fight. Sophie sat back, stunned. She couldn't believe it. For the first time, her art wasn't just about making money. It was about making a connection, about sharing her journey with others who understood the struggle. And that connection was powerful. It gave her strength, gave her hope. But even as the crowds continued to grow, Sophie knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the journey was far from over, but in that moment, Sophie realized that she wasn't alone anymore. The world was watching, and they weren't just seeing her as a girl selling paintings. They were seeing her as an artist, a fighter, a person worth believing in. And that, more than anything, was the most precious gift of all. A special customer, Michael Jordan's unexpected support. The streets around Sophie's art stand buzzed with activity as people rushed by, their lives seemingly too busy to notice the girl sitting at the corner with her canvas and paintbrushes. The city was alive, but Sophie felt invisible. It was as though she had become part of the backdrop. just another person trying to survive in a world that had long since stopped caring. Yet despite the fatigue that weighed her down, the exhaustion in her bones from the chemo treatments and the sweat that trickled down her brow in the summer heat, she refused to give up. Her paintings, each one more than just colors on a canvas, were her only hope, her only chance at survival. Day after day, she showed up at that same street corner. Some days were better than others, but most days were filled with rejection and silence. People stopped, they glanced, and then they moved on. Some asked how much for a painting, only to shake their heads and walk away when Sophie gave them a price. Others merely glanced at the sign, reading "Original Art Funding My Cancer Treatment," and turned their backs, uninterested. It was hard not to feel the sting of that rejection. Sophie tried to keep her spirits up, but the weight of it all began to drag her down. The money she had raised wasn't even close to what she needed, and the looming fear of not being able to afford her next round of treatments was starting to break through her resolve. But then, one afternoon, everything changed. Sophie was sitting at her stand, watching the flow of people pass by, her hands resting on her knees. It was like every other day, people hurrying by, distracted by their own lives. And then, from the crowd, a presence seemed to emerge. Sophie didn't notice at first, absorbed in her thoughts. It wasn't until she felt the stillness around her shift, like a quiet calm that cut through the noise of the street, that she looked up. A tall man stood in front of her booth, his posture relaxed yet confident. He wasn't glancing at his phone or hurrying to the next meeting like everyone else. He was simply standing there, looking at her art. His cowboy hat was tilted slightly, casting a shadow over his face, but his piercing eyes were unmistakable. They were the kind of eyes that had seen decades of history unfold before them, sharp, steady, and knowing. There was something different about him, something familiar. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had seen that face before. No way, she thought. Could it really be him? "See anything you like?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. The man smiled, just a little, a knowing smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He took his time, studying each of the paintings in front of him. And then he turned to her. "Depends," he said slowly, his voice gravelly and low. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. Most people only asked about the price, but this man wasn't asking for a number. He was asking for her story. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then felt something shift inside of her. She didn't know why, but something told her that this was different. This wasn't just another passerby. This was someone who would listen, someone who understood. She swallowed hard, then took a deep breath and began. "I paint because I have to. It's the only thing I can control right now." Her words felt raw as they left her lips, but she pressed on. "I'm fighting cancer. My family's struggling with the cost of treatment, and I'm doing everything I can to help pay for it. Every painting I sell is another chance for me to stay alive." The man listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers as she spoke. Sophie wasn't used to being heard like this. People often pitied her or simply ignored her. But this man, standing before her, wasn't offering pity. He was listening. And in that moment, Sophie felt a quiet understanding pass between them. He glanced at one of the paintings, a black and white canvas depicting a lone cowboy in the distance, silhouetted against a vast desert sky. The shadows and light played off one another, capturing the essence of solitude and strength. It was one of Sophie's favorites, a piece she had poured weeks of work into. With a slow nod, the man reached out and lifted the canvas, tilting it to examine the light and shadows more closely. "This one," he said, his voice steady and unhurried. "I'll take it." Sophie blinked, almost unable to process what was happening. She had sold a few paintings before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just any customer. This wasn't just someone who was going to take home a painting. There was something in his demeanor that told her this was no ordinary transaction. But she nodded, her hands shaking as she went to grab the canvas. "How much is it?" the man asked, his voice still calm. $200, Sophie replied, still in a bit of a daze. The man didn't reach into his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook. A real old-fashioned checkbook. Sophie was momentarily stunned. Nobody used checks anymore. It felt like something out of another era, a moment frozen in time. He carefully opened the checkbook, wrote something down, and tore out the check. Sophie took the check, her fingers trembling as she read it. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. Her vision blurred, her heart skipped a beat, and the world around her seemed to stop. The check wasn't for $200. It was for $50,000. Her breath caught in her throat. This can't be right, she whispered, barely able to form words. The man, still calm, tilted his cowboy hat back just slightly, revealing his face fully for the first time. Sophie's heart stopped. There, standing before her, was none other than Michael Jordan, the basketball legend, the icon. The man whose very presence commanded attention, whose stare had defined generations, was standing in front of her, buying her painting. No, not just buying it, changing her life. Sophie's hands shook violently as she stared at the check in her hand. The realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the check and the man who had just handed it to her. Michael Jordan smiled, a quiet, knowing smirk on his lips. "It's not charity, kid," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's a damn good painting." The words reverberated through Sophie's chest, and she felt something deep inside her shift. This wasn't a pity donation. This wasn't a handout. This was a man who understood what it meant to fight, to give everything you had, to keep going even when the world told you to quit. And now, in the middle of a busy street, Michael Jordan had just given Sophie a chance to keep fighting, a chance to live. The crowd that had gathered around them began to murmur, but Sophie barely noticed. She was too overwhelmed by the reality of what had just happened. She looked at Michael, really looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something more than just a famous athlete. She saw a person who understood her struggle, a person who believed in her fight. Sophie clenched the check in her hand, her fingers tightening around it as though it might slip away. And in that moment, as she looked at the man who had just changed everything for her, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, and it was enough to carry her through. The life-changing moment, a glimmer of hope and the future ahead. The crowd around Sophie's art stand had grown, murmuring in hushed tones as they took in the exchange that had just unfolded before them. Michael Jordan, the living legend, had walked into her life like a force of nature, unannounced and unexpected. His presence was enough to change the course of her entire story. But the true weight of the moment hadn't fully settled in yet. Sophie stood there, holding the check in her trembling hands, her heart racing as the noise of the city faded into the background. In her mind, everything felt distant and surreal, as if she were caught in a dream. The reality of it all had yet to sink in. $50,000. The number was staggering. Sophie had never even dared to imagine receiving such an amount. The medical bills, the looming uncertainty of her treatment, none of it had seemed remotely solvable. But in an instant, Michael Jordan had offered her more than just a donation. He had handed her a lifeline, a tangible chance to keep fighting, to keep painting, to keep believing in tomorrow. She felt her knees buckle, the weight of the moment making her dizzy. But as her hand tightened around the check, Sophie suddenly felt a shift within her, a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just money. It wasn't charity. It was an affirmation. Michael Jordan's gesture wasn't about pity. It was a recognition of her strength, her art, and her unwavering determination. He had seen her. He had believed in her fight. Sophie's thoughts scattered as she looked up at Michael Jordan. He stood there, calm and steady, his gaze not filled with sympathy, but with something much deeper, respect. He didn't see her as a charity case. He didn't pity her. He saw her as an artist, a fighter, a person worthy of a second chance. "It's not about the money," Sophie whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the emotions she had kept buried for so long. I can't believe this is happening. I was just trying to survive." Michael nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet understanding. "You're doing more than surviving, kid. You're fighting. And that's worth supporting." His words hung in the air like a vow, a promise that Sophie was meant to hear. It wasn't just the money that mattered. It was the belief, the validation, the recognition of her struggle. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt something shift deep within her. She wasn't just an artist anymore. She wasn't just a girl selling paintings to fund her chemotherapy. She was a woman with a purpose, a voice, and a story that deserved to be told. As Michael turned to leave, his hand resting lightly on his checkbook as though he had done something simple, Sophie's heart swelled. She wanted to say more, but the words were caught in her throat. She had been given so much more than just money. She had been given a renewed sense of self-worth, a belief in herself, a belief that she wasn't alone in this fight. The world, which had felt so isolating just hours before, now seemed full of possibilities. The streets weren't so crowded with strangers anymore. They were filled with potential, filled with hope. Sophie looked around at the people who had gathered, some still watching the exchange with wide eyes, others murmuring amongst themselves. She felt the shift in energy around her. The air, once thick with doubt and exhaustion, now felt electric, alive with the potential of something new. The next few days passed in a blur, each one filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Sophie returned to her art stand every morning, her hands now steady as she set up her canvases. She painted with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in months, each brushstroke lighter, more vibrant. She poured her soul into every piece, not just as a means of survival, but as a way to express the gratitude and hope that had blossomed in her heart. And it wasn't just the money. Sophie's story spread like wildfire. People came to see her not just for her art, but to hear her story, to be a part of something larger than themselves. Her paintings began to sell faster than she could keep up, but it wasn't the financial success that filled her with pride. It was the connection. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing their own stories of struggle, survival, and hope. It was as though her fight had sparked something in others, a recognition that they, too, could keep fighting. But even with all the support, Sophie knew that the journey wasn't over. Her fight against cancer was still ongoing, and there would be many more battles ahead. She couldn't afford to rest on her laurels. The money from Michael Jordan's check, while substantial, wouldn't be enough to cover everything. But Sophie didn't feel defeated anymore. She had the strength of something deeper now, hope, resilience, and a renewed sense of purpose, and she wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie's art stand became a symbol of perseverance. People came from far and wide to buy her paintings, but they also came to share in her journey. They wanted to be part of her fight, to offer their support, to remind her that she wasn't just a young artist on the street trying to survive. She was a person, an artist, who had the power to change the world around her, one brushstroke at a time. Her future was still uncertain. There were days when the weight of the treatments left her exhausted, when she questioned whether she could keep going. But those moments were fewer now. When Sophie looked at her paintings, she didn't just see colors and shapes, she saw the reflection of her own strength. The same strength that had kept her painting despite the odds. She saw a future where her art could not only heal her body, but also inspire others to find the courage to fight, no matter what life threw their way. Sophie had learned something profound that day. The true power of hope, the strength of community, and the importance of believing in yourself when the world seemed indifferent. And as she stood at her booth, her canvases glowing under the bright sun, Sophie knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't done yet. The fight wasn't over. But thanks to Michael Jordan and the unwavering support of those who believed in her, Sophie knew that the journey ahead would be filled with hope, strength, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Sophie's journey has just begun, and while she's come a long way, there's still a fight ahead. The support from Michael Jordan and countless others has given her a new sense of hope. But she can't do it alone. She's inviting you to be part of her story, whether through sharing, supporting, or simply offering encouragement. If you believe in the power of resilience, art, and community, join Sophie on her journey. Leave a comment, share this story, or simply show your support. Together we can continue to fight and create something meaningful. Subscribe and share your thoughts. Let's keep this journey going.